Since when do we serve animals at this counter? People like you don't belong in my county.
Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens' flat, straight-line mouth curled with sheer condescension as he towered over the corner booth. He cut a sudden, aggressive sweep of his hand through the air, and a full cup of scalding coffee burst forward off the counter. The dark, burning liquid splashing directly across the face of a 60-year-old black woman. Vivian Calloway did not scream. She did not flinch. Her jaw tightened in perfect icy composure as the liquid dripped down onto the collar of her plain gray coat. She fixed her calm, steady gaze right onto his. Beside her, an 84-year-old civil rights veteran trembled. Reaching down toward a smashed pocket watch on the floor, Hutchens barked a harsh, mocking laugh, and he leaned down close enough to spit.
Cry me a river, sweetheart. You think you're somebody? Out here, I am the law. You ain't nobody.
He had no idea who she was. He did not know that this quiet woman in the gray coat was the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. He did not know that the very office whose entire purpose is to find men exactly like him, strip the badge off their chests, and send them to federal prison, had just walked into his diner and ordered breakfast, and he had no idea about the bridge, because 2 miles from the stool he was sitting on, there was a bridge. And 60 years before that morning, on that bridge, that same trembling old man had knelt in his own blood, while another man in another uniform broke that very pocket watch against his skull. It had been stopped ever since, frozen, at 10 minutes past 3. He did not know that a federal convoy was already accelerating up County Road 12. In less than an hour, 6 black Suburbans would surround this diner, and the hunter would dismantle his entire department. She never raised her voice, and by the time they understood who she was, it was already too late. If you have ever been looked at like you were nothing, by someone who had no idea who you really were, stay with me. This one is for you. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to a road in the dark, before any of them knew how the morning would end. Ardell, Mississippi, sits in the flat green palm of the Delta, where the land runs out to the horizon in long rows of soybeans, and the sky is so wide it can make a person feel both free and forgotten at the same time. It is the kind of town the interstate forgot on purpose. One blinking traffic light, a water tower with the high school mascot fading off the side of it, a Baptist church on the black side of the railroad tracks, and a Baptist church on the white side. And between them, 160 years of everything nobody says out loud. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and a rented sedan moved, slow down a county road, headlights still on in the gray. 3 people inside. Behind the wheel was a woman of 60, though she could have passed for younger. Vivian Calloway had a face built for stillness, the kind of composure people mistake for coldness, right up until the moment they need her in a crisis and discover it is the opposite. She wore no jewelry, but a thin wedding band and a pair of small gold studs, a plain gray travel coat, reading glasses pushed up into close-cropped, silver-threaded hair. She drove with both hands on the wheel, the way her father had taught her on these same roads 45 years before. In the passenger seat was that father. The Reverend Solomon Calloway was 84 years old, and folded into himself the way tall men get when the years finally start taking the height back. His hands were enormous, and they trembled. He wore his Sunday suit on a Tuesday, because for him there was no other kind of suit, and a hat that had been brushed so many times the felt had gone soft as cloth. In his lap, both hands wrapped around it, was a pocket watch on a worn chain. The crystal was cracked. The hands had not moved in 60 years. They were stopped at 10 minutes past 3. In the back seat, headphones in, thumb moving across a cracked phone screen, was the future. Isaiah Reed was 17. He had his grandmother's eyes and his dead mother's stubbornness. And he was at the age where everything a grown person says sounds like a song he has already heard. He was there because his Aunt Vivian had made him come. "You are going to know where you're from," she had told him, in the voice that ended discussions. "Before you decide where you're going." They were coming home for the Reverend's birthday. 85 years old that coming Sunday. The whole community was gathering at Mount Moriah. The church Solomon had pastored for 51 years before his knees and his lungs handed the pulpit to a younger man. There would be a dinner on the grounds. There would be people who hadn't seen Vivian since she was a girl who left for college on a Greyhound bus and, in the way of Delta legend, simply did not come back. The same kind of small, "You hungry?" Daddy, Vivian asked. The old man didn't answer right away. He was looking out the window at a field. "Picked cotton in that field," he said finally. "A whole season. I was 9 years old. Old man Pelham paid us by the pound, and he stole half of it back on the scale." He said it without bitterness, the way you would report the weather. Your granddaddy never said a word to that man. He just smiled and got cheated. I used to be ashamed of that smile. He turned the watch over in his hands. Took me 60 years to understand it was the bravest thing I ever saw. The man kept his soul off that scale. Pelham could steal the cotton. He could not steal that. In the back seat, Isaiah pulled one headphone out. He hadn't meant to listen, but he was listening now. "There's a diner up the road," Vivian said softly. "The crossroads. Is it still standing, Pearl Dawes?" The Reverend said. And for the first time, a real smile broke across the deep folds of his face. If that woman is still living, then that diner is still standing. The Lord and Pearl Dawes will go together, or they will not go at all. Vivian smiled too. "Then let's get you some eggs, before everybody in this county finds out you're home and you can't get a minute's peace." She did not tell him what she had done the afternoon before. Sitting in a hotel room 2 hours north with her phone and 3 legal pads. She did not tell him that on Friday morning, before the birthday, she had a meeting in Jackson that she had been dreading for a month. She did not tell him her title. Out there, she was not the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Out there, she was just Solomon's girl, the quiet one, the one who reads, the one who left for 1 more hour. That was all she wanted to be. The Crossroads Diner was a low cinder block building, painted the blue of a robin's egg, with a hand-lettered sign and a screen door that had been slapping shut behind people since before the Voting Rights Act. Inside it smelled like bacon grease and coffee and 70 years of after-church Sunday crowds. The booths were cracked. Red vinyl, mended here and there with duct tape. A pie case turned slowly under a yellow light. And on the wall, framed and faded, hung a photograph of a young preacher in a thin tie, standing in front of this very building with a long line of people behind him. And underneath it, on a piece of masking tape, somebody had written in ballpoint pen, "Freedom Breakfast." 1964, behind the counter, smaller than memory but every bit as immovable, was Pearl Dawes. She was in her 80s, in a hairnet and an apron, working a griddle she had worked for half a century, when the screen door slapped, and she looked up, and she saw who was folding himself carefully through it. The spatula went still in her hand. "Solomon Calloway," she said, and her voice cracked. "Solomon Calloway, you old fool. You didn't tell me you were coming home. Wanted to surprise you. Pearl, you near gave me a heart attack. Is what you did. She came around the counter faster than her hips should have allowed. And she took the old man's face in her two flour-dusted hands and just looked at him. Her eyes shone. His shone back. And for a second, the whole diner, the three farmers at the counter, the trucker in the corner, the young waitress refilling the sugar caddies, all of it went quiet and warm around these two ancient people holding each other up. This is my baby girl, Vivian, the Reverend said. And this here is Isaiah, my grandson, Carolyn's boy, at the name Carolyn, Vivian's sister, dead 3 years now. Pearl's face did a thing, soft and sorrowful, and she folded Isaiah into a hug. He was far too cool to want and far too well-raised to refuse. Lord, you've got her mouth, she told him. I can see it right there. You're going to be trouble. She said it like the highest compliment in the world. And somehow Isaiah understood that it was sit. Sit, Pearl said, herding them toward the big corner booth. The good one. The one under the 1964 photograph. Dakota. Dakota. Baby. Get these people some coffee. This is Reverend Calloway. You hear me. You treat this table like the president himself sat down. The waitress, Dakota, was maybe 19, white, with a tired ponytail and the watchful courtesy of a girl who had worked for tips her whole short life. Yes, Mom, she said, and she meant it. And she brought the coffee careful and warm and called the Reverend Sir without being told to. This is the part people forget about places like Ardell, that there is sweetness in them too. That a Pearl Dawes and a Solomon Calloway had built whole worlds of dignity inside a town that tried to deny them any, and that a 19-year-old white girl pouring coffee could be kind. And that the cruelty, when it came, did not come from the place itself. It came from particular men who decided to be cruel and who had a uniform that let them, because at the counter, 2 of those men were sitting. They had come in 5 minutes before the Calloways. Sheriff's Department, Lowry County. The young one was Deputy Travis Pruitt, 24 years old. Jim thick, a high and tight haircut, and the restless eyes of a man who joined up to feel large. The older one was Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens, mid-50s, gone soft in the gut and hard everywhere else, with a flat, straight-line mouth and a way of leaning back on his stool to survey a room like he held the deed to it. He had 19 years on the department. He had 11 civilian complaints sitting in a file in the basement of the courthouse, and every single one of them had died down there in the dark. When the Reverend came through the door, Hutchens watched. When Pearl came around the counter calling him Reverend Calloway and treating him like a king, Hutchens's jaw worked slowly, like a man chewing something he didn't like the taste of. And when Vivian helped her elderly father lower himself into the booth, and Dakota brought their coffee careful and warm, Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens set his own cup down on the counter with a hard little click. And he said, not quietly, to no one and to everyone at once, sure is getting crowded in here. Pruitt snorted into his coffee. Dakota's shoulders went tight. The temperature in the Crossroads diner dropped 10 degrees. And only some of the people in it could feel it. For a few minutes. It was nothing. It was a look. It was a tone. It was the way Hutchens swiveled half around on his stool to face the corner booth, one elbow on the counter, watching the old man eat his eggs. Vivian felt it before her father did. She had spent her whole career in rooms where the temperature changes before the words do, and she had a lawyer's radar for the exact moment a situation tips from uncomfortable into dangerous. She kept her hands visible. She kept her voice low. She did not look at the deputies directly, because she knew she had spent a career prosecuting the knowledge that for some men, a black person's direct gaze is itself a provocation. They will later swear under oath that they felt threatened by. "Eat up, Daddy," she said quietly. "We'll get on the road." But Solomon Calloway was 84 years old and home and happy. And he was telling Isaiah a story, his big trembling hands moving in the air. And he was laughing. And the laugh, full and free, the laugh of a man at ease in the world, was the thing that did it. Because Sergeant Hutchens decided, somewhere behind that flat, straight mouth, that a black man did not get to be that at ease. Not in his county, not in front of him. He got up off the stool. He hitched his belt. He walked over to the corner booth with the slow, splay-footed swagger of a man who had never once in 19 years had his authority questioned by anybody he considered beneath him. "Since when does Pearl serve animals at her counter?" he said. Loud, pitched for the whole room to hear. And then, to the booth itself. "Morning." And it was not a greeting. "Good morning, officer," Vivian said. "Avon. Warm. Avon, how can we help you?" He ignored her. He looked at the old man instead. "You from around here?" "Boy," the word landed in the diner like a dropped plate. "Pearl." At the griddle. Went rigid. Dakota froze with the coffee pot. The three farmers at the counter developed a sudden, deep interest in their plates. And Isaiah's head came up, his jaw setting in a way that was pure. Carolyn. Pure, his dead mother. And his hand drifted toward his phone. Solomon Calloway looked up at the sergeant. There was a flicker in the old man's eyes. Not fear. Something older. And worse. Recognition. Because he had been called boy by a man with a badge before. On a bridge. 60 years ago. And his body remembered what his mind had spent a lifetime trying to forgive. "I was born in this county," the Reverend said. And his voice was steady and courteous. The voice of 51 years in a pulpit. "I pastored Mount Moriah Church down the road most of my life. My name is Solomon Calloway." "Sir?" "I didn't ask for your life story," Hutchens said. "I asked, are you from around here? And you don't look like you've been around here in a while. And that is a problem for me. Whose car is that out front?" "It's a rental," Vivian said. "It's in my name. I have the agreement right here." "Did I ask you?" Hutchens snapped. And now Pruitt was up too. The young deputy moving around to the other side of the booth, his thumb hooked in his belt, right next to the holster. His face lit up with the ugly excitement of a man who senses that something is finally about to happen. "I'm talking to him." "No. Y'all match the description of some folks who broke into a property over on County Road 9 last night. So I'm going to need everybody's identification. And I'm going to need everybody to keep their hands where I can see them. There was no break-in on County Road 9. There was no description. There was an old black man who had laughed too freely, and a sergeant who had decided that would not stand. This is the oldest lie in the whole South. The lie that built the file in the basement of that courthouse. You match a description. It cannot be disproven, because it was never true to begin with. It is a key that opens any door. Vivian Calloway knew this. She knew it in her bones. And she knew it in the case law. And so she made a decision in that booth. A decision she would think about for the rest of her life. The decision to not end it. Not yet. Not with the one sentence she could have said that would have frozen every man in that room. Because she was not the only person this was happening to. She was the head of the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. and she had read 10,000 pages of incident reports out of towns exactly like Ardell. And she knew, the way you know a stove is hot, that the second she flashed a federal badge, this would stop for her family and continue forever for everyone else. Pearl Dawes would still be there tomorrow. Dakota would still be there. The next black grandfather to laugh too loud in that booth would still be there. So she did the bravest and most disciplined thing in this whole story. She decided to let it happen. She decided to let them show her exactly who they were. On the record, so that what she did next could be done not for the Calloways, but for the whole county. She caught Isaiah's eye across the table, and she gave him the smallest nod toward the phone in his hand. "Record it." The nod said, "Record all of it." What happened next took 4 minutes. Isaiah's phone captured every second of it, propped up against the napkin holder, the lens catching the corner booth and the counter and the 1964 photograph on the wall above them all. They made the old man stand up. An 84-year-old man, in his Sunday suit on a Tuesday, had to plant his enormous trembling hands on the cracked vinyl and push himself up out of the booth while 2 armed deputies watched him struggle and did not help. They made him put his hands on the wall. The Reverend Solomon Calloway, who had baptized half this county and buried the other half, who had once knelt on a bridge and let a man break a watch against his skull rather than raise a hand, put his palms flat against the cinder block underneath his own Freedom Breakfast photograph, and Pruitt kicked his feet apart, and the old man swayed. And Vivian came half out of the booth on instinct, and Hutchens's hand dropped to his weapon. "Sit down," Hutchens said. "Gaze," Pruitt said, snapping his fingers at Vivian. "Car keys." "Now." She slid them across the table without a word. Pruitt scooped them up and went out the screen door. And through the diner window, the whole room watched him pop the trunk of the rented sedan and start throwing things out of it, onto the gravel. The Reverend's overnight bag, the garment bag with his good suit in it, a tin of the lemon cookies that Pearl used to make, that Vivian had bought up north because they reminded her of being a child. He dumped all of it in the dirt. He pawed through the glove box and flung the rental papers out the window, so they scattered across the lot. And he found nothing. Because there was nothing. Because there had never been a break-in on County Road 9. And finding nothing only made him angrier. The way it always does. Because a man who has already decided you are guilty experiences your innocence as an insult. He came back inside. "Trunk's clean," he said, disappointed. Then his eyes landed on Isaiah, who had his phone half raised, and the young deputy's whole face changed. "What are you doing? Are you recording? Give me that phone. He has a right to record," Vivian said, very quietly, in a public place. "That is the law. Deputy, you touch that phone. You have committed another crime." "Another crime," Pruitt repeated. And he laughed. And he looked over at Hutchens. And Hutchens laughed too. And the two of them stood there in that little diner laughing at the very idea that anything they did could possibly be a crime. Because in 19 years and 24 years, it never once had been. You hear this. Roy Dale. She's a lawyer now. They've all got a cousin who's a lawyer. He leaned down into Isaiah's face. "Listen to me. Boy, you point that thing at me one more time, and I'm going to take you outside, and we are going to have a real different kind of conversation. You understand me? Is this your mama? She raised you to disrespect the police, that what your kind learns at home." Isaiah Reed's jaw was trembling, but his hand did not lower that phone. He had his mother's stubbornness, and his great-grandfather's, and somewhere underneath all the fear he understood. In a way, he could never have explained that the single most important thing he would ever do in his life was keep that lens steady so he kept it steady. The lens stayed on. The lens caught everything. Pruitt was patting the old man down now. Rough. His hands going through the soft, worn pockets of the Sunday suit. And out of the inside breast pocket he pulled the pocket watch on its chain. He held it up. The cracked crystal caught the yellow light. "Well, looky here," Pruitt said. "Now this is a nice piece. Is this real gold? Where'd you get this?" "Old man, is this somebody's? Did you boost this off of somebody?" "My father gave me that watch," Solomon Calloway said. And his voice shook now. And it was the first time it had shaken. And it was not because of the wall, or the hands, or the gun. It stopped on March the 7th, 1965. A state trooper hit me with his baton on the Tula River Bridge. And it stopped. And I never wound it again. I have carried it for 60 years. Son, please don't drop my watch. There was a silence in the diner then. A real one. Because some of the people in that room were old enough to know what March 7th, 1965 meant, and what the Tula River Bridge meant. The trucker in the corner had taken his cap off without knowing exactly why. Dakota, the waitress, had tears standing in her eyes, and her hand pressed over her mouth, and Roy Dale Hutchens looked at this old man, broken open and begging for a stopped watch. And something inside of him, something rotten and small and proud, decided that the begging was the most offensive thing of all. "Cry me a river," Hutchens said, and he nodded at Pruitt. "Bag it. We'll check if it's stolen." Pruitt fumbled, maybe on purpose. The watch slipped out of his fingers and hit the diner floor, and the cracked crystal spiderwebbed into 100 brand new lines. And the chain pooled beside it. And for 1 second, the whole world was that watch. Lying there on the linoleum, the Reverend made a sound. A small, terrible sound. And Vivian Calloway was up out of that booth and down on her knees on the diner floor, reaching for her father's watch. And Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens, who had been waiting 19 years for a black woman to give him a reason, picked up his coffee cup off the counter where he had set it down. And he threw it. The coffee was scalding. It caught her across the side of the face, and the jaw, and the collar, as she knelt. And it was hot enough to leave a mark that would still be visible in the photographs the federal investigators took that afternoon. Pearl Dawes screamed. Dakota dropped the pot, and it shattered. Isaiah was on his feet shouting, and Pruitt slammed him back down into the booth with a forearm across his chest. And Vivian Calloway, the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, the most powerful civil rights prosecutor in the country, knelt there on the floor of the Crossroads Diner with her father's broken watch in one hand and coffee running off her chin. And she did not cry out, and she did not curse, and she did not wipe her face. She looked up at Roy Dale Hutchens, and she let him see her eyes. And in a voice so quiet that the recording barely caught it, she said one sentence: "You are going to remember this morning for the rest of your life." Hutchens laughed. He actually laughed. "Is that a threat? You hear that? Travis, she's threatening an officer." He crouched down, getting right in her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee and the cigarettes on him. "Let me tell you something. Sweetheart, out here, I am the law, not you, not him." He flicked a hand at the begging old man. "People like you come through my county thinking you're somebody. You ain't nobody. You hear me? You ain't nobody." He stood back up, satisfied. He had made his point. He had restored the order of things. He had no idea that he had just put 19 years of buried complaints and 160 years of a county's history onto a federal docket. He had no idea that the woman he had just told "you ain't nobody" was At that exact moment, the single most important person in the United States government on the subject of what he had just done. But Vivian Calloway knew, and from her knees, with her father's watch closed up in her fist, she made her phone call. Now, if you have made it this far, I need you to do something for me. Tell me in the comments where you're from. And tell me one thing your grandparents survived that you are standing on top of right now. Because that is what this story is really about. Now, stay with me. Because everything is about to change. I need to make a phone call. Vivian said, rising slowly to her feet. It is my right. You can listen to every word. Go right ahead. Hutchens said, leaning back against the counter, arms crossed, smug as a cat. Call whoever you want. Call the governor. Pruitt laughed. She took out her phone. She did not dial the emergency line. She did not dial a lawyer. She dialed a number she knew by heart. A number that rang in a building in Washington, on Pennsylvania Avenue, and was answered on the first ring by a man whose entire job was to answer it on the first ring. This is Calloway, she said. Her voice was perfectly level. I'm in Ardell, Mississippi, at a diner called the Crossroads, on County Road 12. I have been assaulted by a Lowry County Sheriff's deputy. My 84-year-old father and my 17-year-old nephew are being unlawfully detained. I need the marshal's protective detail here now. I need the Jackson field office notified. And I need you to call the Deputy Attorney General and tell her I am invoking. She'll know what it means. A pause. The voice on the other end said something short. Yes, Vivian said. All of it is being recorded. Move. She hung up. The deputies were grinning at each other. They had heard the words marshals, and Washington, and Attorney General. And to them, it sounded like the desperate bluffing of every nobody who ever sat handcuffed on a curb swearing they had a cousin who was a lawyer. They had heard it 1,000 times. It never meant anything. But the diner had gone strange, and still around them. The 3 farmers at the counter had set down their forks. The trucker in the corner was no longer pretending not to film. And in the kitchen doorway, Pearl Dawes was watching the woman in the gray coat, with a slow, dawning look on her ancient face. Because Pearl, who had known the Calloway family 60 years, who had held Vivian as a baby, who read the church bulletins and watched the evening news, was starting to remember something she had read once, about Solomon's quiet daughter, and a confirmation hearing up in Washington, and her hand had come up to her chest. Pearl Dawes was the only person in the Crossroads diner who had begun to guess what was about to come up County Road 12, and the look on her face was not fear anymore. It was something closer to awe. It was the look of a woman who had waited 60 years to watch the scale finally tip the other way, and who had just realized she was about to see it happen in her own diner, over her own coffee, on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Marshals. Hutchens chuckled, shaking his head. She's going to call the marshals on us. Travis, are you scared? I'm scared. He raised his voice for the whole diner. Y'all hear that? We got us a federal customer this morning. Pearl Dawes came around the counter again, and she put herself between the deputies and the old man. This tiny woman, in a hairnet, her hands shaking with fury. You ought to be ashamed, she said, low and trembling. I have known this man 60 years. He is the finest man in this county. And you put your hands on him. God sees you. Roy Dale Hutchens. God sees you. Sit down. Pearl, before I cite you for disorderly, Hutchens said, but something in his eyes flickered, because he had known Pearl his whole life too, eaten her pie as a boy, and being called Roy Dale by her in that voice reached somewhere a uniform cannot protect. Vivian helped her father back into the booth. She pressed a napkin to the side of her own burned face. Finally, almost absently, the way you would dab at a spill, she picked the broken watch up off the floor and folded it into the old man's huge, trembling hands and closed his fingers around it. "It's all right, Daddy," she said quietly. I've got it now. They are going to wish they had never touched it." "Vivi," her father whispered, her child name, the one nobody had used in 40 years. "Baba, don't make trouble for these men. I have seen what these men do when you make trouble. I am all right. It is only a watch." She knelt down by him one more time, and she took his face in her hands the way Pearl had an hour before. And she looked into his eyes. It was never only a watch. "Daddy," she said, "and I am not a little girl on this road anymore. I want you to do something for me. I want you to sit right here, and I want you to watch what your daughter does. I have spent 30 years getting ready for this morning. I just never knew it would happen in Ardell. Outside, very faint, on the flat delta wind, there was a sound, an engine, then another, then more, growing. Pruitt frowned and looked toward the window. "What is that?" It was 6:51 in the morning. The call had gone out 40 minutes before. And 40 minutes, it turned out, was exactly how long it took. They came up County Road 12 in a line, and they did not slow down. 6 black Suburbans, government plates, antennas on the back, windows like smoked glass, moving in tight formation through the soybean fields at a speed. No civilian drives a back road. Dust boiled up behind them in a long brown wall. They peeled off the road into the gravel lot of the Crossroads Diner, one after another, fanning out into a precise arc. And before the last one had even stopped rolling, the doors were already opening, men and women in tactical vests over polo shirts, sidearms, federal credentials swinging on lanyards. Some of the vests said United States Marshal across the back in white block letters. Some of them said FBI. They moved with the unhurried, total competence of people for whom this was just a Tuesday, fanning out across the lot, 2 of them taking position at the diner door. And through the screen, the farmers at the counter watched with their mouths hanging open. And the trucker said, very softly, "Sweet Jesus." The lead vehicle's passenger door opened, and a man stepped down. He was black, 50 years old, built like a former linebacker, gone gray at the temples, in a charcoal suit with a marshal's star on his belt, and his face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. This was Deputy United States Marshal Curtis Bowen, and Vivian Calloway had been his principal for 2 years. And in 2 years, he had never once gotten a call like the one he had gotten 40 minutes before. And on the drive down, he had had to consciously slow his own breathing. He came in through the screen door. It slapped shut behind him. He took in the whole room in one sweep. The broken coffee pot, the shattered watch crystal on the floor, the napkin pressed to his principal's burned face, the old man in the booth, the boy held down, the 2 deputies frozen at the counter with their mouths still half open on a laugh that was dying right there on their lips. And Deputy United States Marshal Curtis Bowen crossed that diner, and he stopped in front of the corner booth, and he came to attention, and he said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "Madam Assistant Attorney General, I'm sorry. It took us 40 minutes. Are you injured? Do you need medical?" The diner stopped breathing. Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens' face went the color of paste. "I'm fine." "Curtis," Vivian said, rising to her feet. setting the napkin down on the table. My father needs to be checked by a paramedic. Get one. She turned. And now, only now, she let her full self come up to the surface. And the room watched a quiet woman in a coffee-stained gray coat transform into the most powerful person any of them would ever stand in a room with. For the benefit of the deputies, she said, and her voice filled the Crossroads diner the way her fathers used to fill Mount Moriah Church. Let me introduce myself properly, since they never bothered to ask. My name is Vivian Calloway. I am the Assistant Attorney General of the United States for the Civil Rights Division. I run the office inside the United States Department of Justice, whose entire job is investigating and prosecuting police officers who violate the constitutional rights of the people they are sworn to protect. She let that sit. 3 full seconds. Long enough. That is my job. Gentlemen, that is my whole job. And you just did it. In front of me. Pruitt made a small noise. Hutchens's mouth opened. And nothing came out. You could watch it move across his face. The comprehension. Arriving in pieces. Each one worse than the last. First, the simple fact she's federal. Then the worse fact. She is not just federal. She is the very top of federal. An Assistant Attorney General. A name that has to be confirmed by the United States Senate. And then, last of all, the fact that emptied the blood right out of his face. The one that made a 19-year man grip the edge of the counter so he wouldn't slide off the stool. That of all the federal offices in all of Washington, the one office he had just spent 4 minutes performing his whole ugly catechism in front of. The papers, the wall, the watch, the coffee. You ain't nobody. Was the one office in the entire United States government whose only purpose on this earth is to find men exactly like Roy Dale Hutchens and take everything they have. He had not just assaulted a powerful woman. He had assaulted the hunter. He had stood in front of the one person in America whose whole career is built out of the bones of men who do what he had just done. And he had done it slow. And he had done it proud. And he had done it with the camera running. Travis Pruitt had started talking. It came babbling out of him. The way it always comes out of the young ones when the floor drops away. Madam, attorney, we were responding to a call. There was a call. There was no call. And everyone in the diner knew there was no call. And the fact that the first thing out of his mouth was the lie was itself the confession. Roy Dale. Tell her, Roy Dale said. I was just following. He looked over at Hutchens for rescue, and he found a gray-faced old man on a stool who had nothing left to give him, who had, in fact, just understood that the kid clutching at his sleeve was now, legally, the very least of his problems. The thin blue line, it turns out, is only a line, as long as nobody ever comes to test it. The instant the federal government walked through the screen door of the Crossroads diner, the line dissolved into exactly what it always was. 2 frightened men who hurt people because they were sure that no one would ever make them stop. Vivian Calloway did not raise her voice at either of them. She did not have to. She had, in fact, already stopped looking at them. Because to her, and this is the cruelest thing of all, crueler than any sentence she could ever pass, they had become small. They had become a case file. They had become work. She turned to Curtis Bowen instead. Marshal Bowen, these 2 men are not to leave this property. The FBI agents are going to secure their body cameras, their service weapons, and their vehicle dash recordings. And they are going to do it now, before anything gets lost. The way things get lost in this county's basement. She looked back at Hutchens, and her voice dropped to almost nothing. I have read your basement. Sergeant, 11 complaints. I had your file pulled yesterday afternoon, before I ever set foot in this diner, because I read every officer's file in every county I drive through in the state of Mississippi. It's a habit. It's the job. A pause. I just never expected to meet you. And Roy Dale Hutchens. 19 years on the badge. 11 buried complaints. The law of Lowry County. Sat down hard on a diner stool, because his legs would not hold him. In the booth, the Reverend Solomon Calloway was weeping, quietly, openly, the tears running down the deep folds of his 84-year-old face, both hands wrapped around a broken watch. He was looking at his daughter the way a man looks at the sunrise after the longest night of his life. "That's my girl," he whispered. To no one. To everyone. To 60 years. That's my girl. Here is what most stories get wrong, and what this one will not. The badge does not fall in an instant. Power does not surrender because it has been embarrassed. It surrenders because it is forced. With paper, and with procedure, and with a chain of custody that cannot be broken. And Vivian Calloway had spent her whole career learning exactly how to force it. She did not arrest the deputies herself. She was careful about this. Careful in a way that the deputies, watching, did not understand. And that you need to. She was a victim now, and a witness. And so the one thing she would not do was touch the prosecution with her own 2 hands. Because she would not give some defense lawyer, 2 years down the road, the gift of standing up and saying she had abused her office for personal revenge. She was going to do this clean, so clean it would hold, so clean it would change the law. And not just the morning, within the hour. The FBI agents secured both deputies' body-worn cameras. Both of them, it turned out, had been malfunctioning. Switched off. At the exact moment Hutchens approached the booth. A fact that is itself a federal crime. And a fact that would end up meaning nothing at all. Because Isaiah Reed's phone, propped up against a napkin holder, had caught all 4 minutes in clean daylight. With sound. And the diner's own ceiling camera had caught the wide shot, and the trucker in the corner, it turned out, had been live streaming the whole thing to 41 viewers on a trucking forum, one of whom had screen recorded it. There was no killing this story. There was no basement deep enough. The Jackson field office of the FB. I opened a file before Vivian had even finished her first fresh cup of coffee, which Dakota the waitress brought to her with hands that were still shaking and eyes that were still wet. She set it down, and she whispered, "I am so sorry. Mom, I am so sorry. I should have said something. I just..." And Vivian took the girl's hand, and she said, gently, "You poured my father's coffee like he was a king when you didn't have to. He saw it. I saw it. Now you say something. Now you tell them everything you have ever seen in here. Every single time. Going back as far as you can remember. Now is when you're brave." And Dakota nodded, and wiped her face on her apron, and went to go find an agent. Sheriff Lonnie Briggs arrived at 20 minutes to 8 in his personal truck, his hat in his hand, sweating clean through his shirt. And the moment he stepped into that lot and saw 6 federal Suburbans and a marshal's protective detail, he understood that his county's quiet little arrangement, the basement full of complaints, the descriptions that were never real, the way things worked out here, had reached the end of its life. So he tried the only play he had left. He tried to be helpful. He tried to be shocked. "I had no idea," he told the agents, mopping his face. "These men acted alone. This is not how we do things in Lowry County." He said this standing 20 feet away from the woman who, that very afternoon, would subpoena every page of the personnel files he had spent 19 years sitting on. By 8:30, both deputies had surrendered their service weapons and their badges. Pending suspension, they were not arrested at the diner. Vivian insisted on doing it through the United States Attorney's Office, in the proper channel. But they were stripped, and they were suspended, and they knew, the way you know a season has turned, that the badge they had pinned on that morning was the last one they would ever wear, and the Reverend Solomon Calloway, checked over by a paramedic and pronounced bruised but unbroken, sat in the corner booth, underneath his own 1964 photograph, and watched the United States government dismantle, piece by careful piece, the same kind of power that had broken his body on a bridge 60 years before. They never even said sorry. He murmured, looking down at the watch in his hands. The crystal, 100 fresh cracks, on the bridge. None of them ever said sorry. Not in 60 years. Vivian sat down beside him and put her arm around her father's shoulders, and the two of them looked at the broken watch together. They are going to say a lot more than sorry. Daddy, she said, but sorry was never the point. The point is that nobody else's child ever has to kneel on this floor. That is the only thing worth anything. That is the only justice that lasts. The story was in Jackson by noon, and in Washington by nightfall. Isaiah's footage, 4 minutes, daylight clear, went up first on his own account, and then everywhere. By the next morning, it had been watched 11 million times. The frame the whole country froze on was the same one. A 60-year-old woman on her knees on a diner floor, coffee running off her chin, reaching for a stopped pocket watch, with a sergeant's cup still in the air above her, and a 1964 Freedom Breakfast photograph hanging on the wall just behind her head. 2 images, 60 years apart, in one single frame, the past and the present, in one shot. Nobody who saw it ever forgot it. And then came the part that turns a viral video into a reckoning, because once the country knew what had been done to Vivian Calloway, the people of Lowry County, who could never make that phone call, stopped being afraid. On a bit one, they came forward, and the federal investigators were there to listen, with patience, and with recorders, and with the full weight of the United States standing behind them. And what they heard was the basement. Finally, speaking out loud, a man named Cornell Biggs, 31 years old, came forward to say that 4 years ago, Roy Dale Hutchens had stopped him on a back road, accused him of a burglary that had never happened, and held him in the county jail for 9 days before quietly releasing him with no charges and no apology. 9 days that cost him the only steady job he had ever had. A woman named Loretta Means, 66, a retired nurse, came forward to say that Hutchens had once pulled her from her car at gunpoint over a license plate light, made her lie face down, in a ditch in her church clothes, and called her the kind of names you do not say in front of your grandchildren, and that when she filed a complaint, a deputy had come to her house that very evening and suggested, real friendly, that she might want to think about her family before she went making trouble. A 19-year-old named Deshaun came forward with a phone video of his own, 8 months old, that he had been too frightened to ever post, showing Deputy Pruitt kneeling on his back in a gas station parking lot, and a woman named Sharonda Pike, 34 years old, a mother of 3, came forward to say something she had never told anyone. Not her husband, not her pastor, that 2 years ago, after Hutchens pulled her over and ran her name and made her stand out in the rain while he searched her car in front of her children. Her oldest boy, 8 years old then, had started wetting the bed and waking up screaming about the flashlight, and that she had spent 2 years and money she did not have on a counselor for a little boy whose only sickness was that he had watched a man with a badge treat his mother like a criminal on the side of the road. She testified to all of this in a level voice. And then she said the thing the whole investigation turned on. I never filed a complaint. Because what is the point? Everybody knows what the point is. You file a complaint against Roy Dale Hutchens in Lowry County. And the only thing that happens is Roy Dale Hutchens finds out you filed it. And every black person in that county, listening, nodded, because they had all done the same arithmetic. And the arithmetic had always come out the same way. For 19 years. Until a woman in a gray coat knelt down on a diner floor and changed the math, there were 11 complaints in the basement. By the end of that week, the FBI had interviewed 40 more people who had never filed at all. Because filing had never once worked. Because everybody in Ardell, on the black side of the tracks, had learned the same lesson the same way. You keep your soul off the scale, because the scale is rigged, and the man weighing you has a gun. Pearl Dawes gave a statement that ran 4 hours, 60 years of it, things she had watched happen inside her own diner and never told a living soul. And when the agent finally thanked her and turned off the recorder, the old woman sat very still for a moment. And then she said, "You know how long I have been waiting for somebody to ask me that 60 years. I have been carrying it 60 years. And not once did anybody ever ask." And she put her face down into her flour-dusted hands and cried the cry of a woman finally setting down something she had carried her whole life. 3 weeks after the morning at the Crossroads Diner, in the federal courthouse in Jackson, the United States of America filed charges against Sergeant Roy Dale Hutchens and Deputy Travis Pruitt. The charge was the one Vivian Calloway had spent her whole career on: deprivation of rights under color of law, the federal statute that makes it a crime for a government official to use the power of the state to violate the constitutional rights of a citizen, assault, falsification of records, for the body cameras switched off at the convenient moment, and for Hutchens, additional counts, because the basement was open now, and the basement was full. But here is the choice that defines Vivian Calloway, and it is the exact opposite of the choice in a revenge story. She recused herself, entirely, from all of it. She did not prosecute the men who burned her face. She could not, and she would not have, even if she could, because the second she did, she would hand them the only defense they had left, that this was personal, that the federal government had come down on Lowry County because some big-shot official got her feelings hurt in a diner. So she walked into the office of the Deputy Attorney General, and she formally handed the entire matter over to an independent team and to the United States Attorney for the district. And she gave them one single instruction: treat it like I was never there. Treat me like any other witness. And if the case cannot stand without me, then I do not want it. It could stand without her. That was the whole point. 40 witnesses, and 11 million viewers, and a basement full of buried complaints. It could stand on its own, which is exactly how she designed it. From her knees, on the diner floor, Roy Dale Hutchens and Travis Pruitt went to trial. The footage was shown to the jury: Isaiah's 4 minutes, the ceiling camera, the trucker's live stream. The witnesses testified, one after another: Cornell Biggs, and Loretta Means, and Deshawn, and Sharonda Pike, and Pearl Dawes. The basement emptied out into the light of a federal courtroom, and the jury, a Mississippi jury, in a Mississippi courthouse, convicted Roy Dale Hutchens. The law of Lowry County was sentenced to federal prison. Travis Pruitt was sentenced to federal prison, and Sheriff Lonnie Briggs, whose 19-year project of burying complaints in a basement was now the centerpiece of a federal report. Resigned in disgrace and faced obstruction charges of his own. But none of that. Not 1 minute of it. Not one cell door. Was the thing Vivian Calloway had come home to do. The convictions were individual. They punished 3 men. And the lesson of her father's entire life. The lesson stopped at 10 minutes past 3 on a broken watch. Was that individual men are never the disease. They are only the symptom of a system that protects them. You can lock up every Roy Dale Hutchens in the state of Mississippi, and the next one will pin on the very same badge and find the very same basement waiting for him. So Vivian Calloway did the thing that no jury and no single trial can ever do. She did the thing she runs the entire Civil Rights Division to do. She opened a pattern or practice investigation into the entire Lowry County Sheriff's Department. A pattern or practice investigation is not about 1 bad morning or 3 bad men. It is the federal government putting an entire institution under the microscope. Every stop, every arrest, every use of force, every complaint, every dollar, going back years, to determine whether the abuse was a few rotten apples or, as it almost always turns out to be, the whole orchard. The investigation into Lowry County took 14 months. Federal attorneys and statisticians and investigators combed through 19 years of records, and what they found and laid out in a public report that the whole country read was exactly what the people of Ardell could have told them for free. If anybody had ever once asked, a department that stopped and searched black drivers at 6 times the rate of white drivers, that used force against black residents far out of any proportion, that maintained, in a basement, a system for making complaints disappear, that ran the descriptions that were never real as standard daily practice, a department that had, in short, 2 sets of laws in one small county, the same way the county had always had 2 sets of everything, and those 14 months were not quiet ones in Ardell. The old arrangement did not die politely. Anonymous letters went out. A brick came through the window of Pearl Dawes's diner one night, with a note wrapped around it, and Pearl swept up the glass and taped a piece of cardboard over the hole, and opened up for breakfast the next morning at 5 o'clock sharp, the way she had for 50 years, and told the federal monitor's office, "You tell whoever threw that. I have been here longer than they have been alive, and I will be here after they are gone." Some of the white families who had run that county quietly closed ranks. Some of them, quietly, did not, and a few of them, for the first time in their entire lives, started showing up to the community meetings at Mount Moriah and sitting in the back and listening. Dakota, the waitress, among them, and that, too, was part of what changed. The young people organized. They registered voters. The way Solomon Calloway's generation had bled to be allowed to, except now nobody broke a watch against their heads for it. By the time the agreement was signed, there was a coalition in Lowry County that had not existed before that morning at the crossroads. Black and white, old and young, and a coalition. Vivian Calloway knew better than anyone alive, is the only thing that ever makes one of these agreements actually stick. After the monitor goes home, the report became the basis for a consent decree, a binding federal agreement, enforced by a court and overseen by an independent monitor, that the Lowry County Sheriff's Department had to obey or be taken over. And the decree did what no single conviction ever could. Every deputy had to wear a body camera, on, recording, every shift, with criminal penalties for switching it off, an independent civilian oversight board, with real subpoena power, with real teeth. was created to review every complaint, and the board was staffed with people from the community, including, at her own insistence, Pearl Dawes. The basement was emptied out into the daylight. Every buried complaint from the last 19 years was reopened and reviewed. A public online portal was created where any resident could file a complaint that went straight to the federal monitor, where no deputy could ever reach it. Pretextual stops were banned. The descriptions that were never real were banned. Every deputy in the county was retrained, and the training was run, in part, by the Civil Rights Division, by Vivian Calloway's own office, though she herself never once set foot in it, because she was still, and always, doing it clean. And there was a new sheriff in Lowry County, the first black sheriff in its history, a former state trooper named Marcus Greer, who ran on that consent decree, and won. In a county that white power had run since before anybody living could remember, it was not paradise. Vivian Calloway was the last person on earth to pretend that it was black. A consent decree is a leash, not a cure. It can be fought and slow-walked and outlasted by patient men who just wait for the monitor to leave. She knew all of this. She had watched it happen in other towns. But it was real. It was structural. It would outlive every single person who had been in that diner, and it meant that the next black grandfather who laughed too freely at the Crossroads Diner would not have to kneel on the floor for it. That was always the only justice worth the drive home. No. Just a quick word, because this part matters. If you have read this far, then you already know that this is not really a story about a phone call. Au convoy. It is about what changes after the cameras leave. So tell me in the comments, what is one thing in your town that still needs the daylight let into it? A basement of complaints that nobody has ever opened. I read every single one. Now, let us finish this. The Reverend Solomon Calloway turned 85 years old on a Sunday, and all of Ardell came to Mount Moriah to celebrate it. They came in their church clothes, and they spilled out of the pews and into the aisles and out the doors onto the grass, because the little church his hands had built could not hold the number of people who loved him. There was a dinner on the grounds that ran from noon until the lightning bugs came up. There was a choir that raised the old songs, the ones from the bridge days, the ones they had sung to keep their courage up back when courage was all they had. And there was a moment, near the end of the service, when the new young pastor stepped aside and asked the Reverend Solomon Calloway to say a few words. And the old man rose, slow, on his daughter's arm, and made his way to the pulpit one last time. He stood there a moment, in the place he had stood 10,000 Sundays. He took out the watch. He held it up so the light came through the cracked crystal. 60 years ago, he said, and the whole church went silent. A man with a badge broke this watch against my head, on the Tula River Bridge, because I wanted to vote, and it stopped. He turned it over in his fingers, and I never wound it again, because I wanted to remember. I wanted to remember the very minute the world told me I wasn't anybody. He looked out at them. He looked at Pearl Dawes in the second row, at Loretta Means, at Cornell Biggs, at the new sheriff, Marcus Greer, sitting in the back in his civilian clothes, at Dakota the waitress, who had driven out because she wanted to come, sitting near the door. Welcome, 3 weeks ago, the Reverend said. Another man with a badge threw a cup of coffee in my daughter's face, on the floor of Pearl's diner, for the very same reason, because he decided she wasn't anybody. His voice broke, and he let it. 60 years. Children. 60 years between that bridge and that diner, and it was the same evil, wearing the same badge, saying the very same words. And I sat in that booth, 84 years old, and I thought, Lord, has anything changed at all? Did we march for nothing? Did they break this watch for nothing? He paused, and then my baby girl got up off of that floor, with coffee running down her face. And she made one phone call, and the whole United States government came up County Road 12 to answer it. The tears were running freely down the deep folds of his face, and he did not stop them. And half the church was weeping right along with him. And I understood the thing I had been too tired and too sad to see. The watch stopped. Children, but we did not. The bridge was the seed, and I have lived long enough. The Lord let me live long enough to see that seed become a tree. My daughter could climb all the way to the top of all the way up to where she could reach down and pull this whole county up into the light. That is what changed. Not the evil. The evil is patient. What changed is us. He held up the watch one final time. I always said this watch would stay stopped until the work was done. He said, and the work is not done. It will not be done in my lifetime, or my daughter's, or my grandson's. But this morning, before church, I wound it. A murmur went through the whole church. First time in 60 years. Because I wanted to give it to the next one with it running. I wanted him to know the clock is moving again. I wanted him to know it is now his job to keep it that way. And he looked down at the front pew, at Isaiah Reed, 17 years old. His dead mother's stubbornness all over his face. And the tears all over it too. Isaiah, come up here. Son. The boy came up. The old man pressed the watch into his huge young hands and folded his own enormous trembling ones around them. The same way Vivian had on the diner floor. The same way Pearl had at the counter. The same gesture. And handed down. The same way it had always been handed down in this family. By holding on. This is yours now. The Reverend said. It is running again. Don't you ever let it stop. You hear me? And Isaiah Reed, who 3 weeks before had been a boy with headphones in, who thought everything the old people said was a song he had already heard, held his great-grandfather's watch up to his ear, and heard it ticking, and said, in a voice that cracked clean in half, yes, Sir, I hear you. The next morning, before dawn, the rented sedan moved slow back down the county road, headlights on in the gray, the same way it had come. Vivian Calloway drove. Her father dozed in the passenger seat, the old hat down over his eyes. And in the back, Isaiah Reed sat with the watch in his palm, looking at it, then out the window at the fields where his great-grandfather had picked cotton and been cheated on the scale, then back at the watch. Aunt Viv, he said quietly, so as not to wake the old man. I want to do what you do. She did not take her eyes off the road, but something moved across her face. It is hard work. Baby, she said, it is the hardest work there is. You spend your whole life pushing a boulder up a hill, and some mornings you watch it roll all the way back down. And you have to get up the next day and push it again, knowing full well it might roll right back down again. There is no jet at the end of it. There is no big check. Most days, nobody even knows your name. I don't care about a jet, Isaiah said. Vivian Calloway smiled then. The first full and easy smile she had allowed herself in 3 weeks. I know you don't, she said. That is exactly why you will be good at it. They drove a while in silence. The sun came up over the delta, that wide, forgiving delta light, and it caught the cracked crystal of the watch in the boy's hand and threw a small, broken rainbow up across the roof of the car. Aunt Viv, Isaiah said again, "Can I ask you something? When that man threw the coffee, when you were down on the floor," he hesitated. "Weren't you scared?" She thought about how to answer that one honestly. She thought about it for a long mile. "I was," she said finally. "Not of him. I was scared of what I would do if I let myself be just an old man's daughter for one more second. Because if I had let myself be only that, only your great-granddaddy's hurt little girl, I would have flashed my badge in his face the second he said, 'Boy,' and it would have ended right there. He would have apologized and let us go, and we would have driven off. And Roy Dale Hutchens would have done the exact same thing to somebody else by lunchtime." She glanced up into the rearview mirror at her nephew. "The hardest thing I have ever done, Isaiah, was stay down on my knees on that floor 1 second longer than I had to, because some part of me knew that the only way to help everybody was to let him hurt me all the way. First, on the record, with the camera running." She paused. "That is the job. Baby, that is the whole job. It is learning when not to use the power you have, so that you can use it on something that lasts." Isaiah was quiet for a long time. Then he closed his hand around the running watch. "I hear you," he said. "Sometime later, on the Tula River Bridge, the bridge where it all began, 60 years and 3 weeks before, the county dedicated a marker. It was a simple thing. A bronze plaque on a stone, at the spot where the marchers had been beaten, with the names of every one of them who could be found, living and dead. And at the very bottom, the date, March 7th, 1965. The new sheriff was there. Pearl Dawes was there, in her good dress. Loretta Means and Cornell Biggs and Deshawn were there. Dakota was there. The community that white power had run since before memory stood together on that bridge in the morning light, and the Reverend Solomon Calloway, 85 years old, stood at the marker with his daughter on one arm and his great-grandson on the other. And they let him pull the cloth off the bronze, and when he read his own name on it, Solomon Calloway, age 24, among the names of friends who had not lived to read theirs, the old man bowed his head, and he did not speak, because there are some things too full for words, even from a man who preached for 51 years. A reporter was there, and as the small crowd began to drift off the bridge, she caught Vivian Calloway near her car, and she asked her the question that reporters always ask. "Madam Assistant Attorney General, what do you want people to take away from what happened here?" Vivian Calloway stood a moment in the Delta light. Behind her, on the bridge, her father was running his fingers over his own name in the bronze. Beside her, her nephew had the watch in his pocket, and it was ticking. "That dignity is not something a badge can give you," she said, "and it is not something a badge can take away. My father had every bit of his dignity on his knees on that bridge 60 years ago. I had every bit of mine on my knees on that diner floor 3 weeks ago. They never touched it. They never can. That is the one thing they can never reach. No matter how many of them there are. No matter how big the gun is." She looked back at the old man and the boy. "But the law is ours too. They do not get to keep it just for themselves anymore. And the day enough of us stop being afraid to make them prove it, in the daylight, on the record, that is the day it finally starts to change." "And the man who threw the coffee?" the reporter asked. "Hutchens. Do you forgive him?" Vivian thought about that one. "Too. I don't have to," she said quietly. "Forgiveness is my father's business. It always was. It is the one thing he was ever truly great at. Greater than I will ever be. My business is the other thing. My business is making sure that the next man who wants to throw the coffee knows all the way down in his gut. That the floor is not his anymore. That somebody is watching. That somebody will answer the phone. She opened her car door. He spent 19 years certain that nobody would ever come up that road. Now every man with a badge in this state knows that somebody just might. That is not forgiveness. But it will do more good than forgiveness ever did. And it will do it for people who will never even know my name. She got into the car, through the windshield. She watched her father on the bridge a moment longer. The old man's hand flat against the bronze, against his own name, against 60 years. And then she watched him straighten up, slow, on his great-grandson's arm, and turn, and start back toward her across the bridge, into the morning, into the light, the boy beside him, the watch ticking in the boy's pocket, the clock moving again. She started the engine. The work was not done. It would not be done in her lifetime, but it was moving, and that was enough. A sheriff's deputy threw a cup of scalding coffee in a quiet woman's face, on the floor of a Mississippi diner, because he decided she wasn't anybody. He had no idea he was looking at the most powerful civil rights prosecutor in the country. He had no idea her father had bled on a bridge 2 miles away, 60 years before. For the right to be looked at as a man, he had no idea that the watch he let drop on that diner floor had been stopped for 60 years, and that a boy in that booth would carry it out into the world, with it ticking again. Vivian Calloway never raised her voice. She never threw a punch. She got up off of that floor, and she made one phone call, and she let the whole weight of a country she had spent her life trying to make honest come up a back road to answer it. And when it was done, she did not take a check, and she did not take revenge. She took an entire county's broken system, and she dragged it, complaint by buried complaint, up into the daylight, so that no other grandfather, and no other daughter, and no other child would ever have to kneel on that floor and learn the lesson the hard way. That was her justice. The quiet kind, the patient kind, the structural kind, the kind that outlives the very people who fought for it, the kind that, eventually, runs the clock out on the men who were so sure the clock would never start again. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been treated like you were nobody, by somebody who had no idea who you really were, or whose grandparents you were standing on top of, then do something with it. Don't carry it 60 years, the way Pearl Dawes did. Before somebody finally asked, "Tell it." Put it in the comments below. Tell me where you're from. And tell me the name of the one person in your family whose courage you are living on top of right now. I read every single one. And if a story about dignity and patience and the long, slow work of justice means something to you, then subscribe and stay with us, because there is always another bridge. There is always another diner. There is always another watch that has been stopped for far too long. And there is always somebody, somewhere, about to find out that the quiet one in the gray coat was never nobody at all.